Okay, I hit the button. Okay, now it's on. Okay. Okay. So there was this public parking lot. It was $2 parking. So I can handle $2. But they had this big metal board sitting up there with little slots with numbered spaces. And I looked at that thing, and there was not hardly any instructions. They just said $2 a day, and you'll get ticketed if you don't pay. So I looked at that, and I thought, I think they want me to stuff two $1 bills into the slot. And I was trying to stuff it. I was like, I feel like, you know how you see people like at a vending machine for coins, and you see them trying to put a paper dollar in the coin slot? I felt like that. I said, this is crazy. But yeah, then I looked down, and there was this tool that you used to stuff the dollar bills into the slot. And so I stuffed my $2 bills in there, and I didn't get a ticket, so I guess maybe either they didn't check or I did it right, but I couldn't believe it. So then I was rushing off. I was hurrying off to the church, and right when I got to the entrance, I was really hustling because I wanted to get there and try to get a good seat. And there's this big SUV that pulls up, and this guy jumps out of the SUV, and I said, well, this guy's not getting ahead of me. So I pushed past him, and as I pushed past him, I heard somebody say, well, hi, Governor, how are you? So I won't be getting a job in Alabama government very soon. But I did want to tell you that the vestiture was great. And Brother Chris, if you want to know what kind of person he is, what kind of justice he'll make on the Alabama Supreme Court, I'll read this to you. He, when he first got up there, he says, I want to quote to you 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 18. It's a verse about King David, him crying to the Lord, King David crying to the Lord. Then went King David in and sat before the Lord and said, who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that thou hast brought me hitherto? That was the attitude of King David. It says in verse 1, and it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. Then the Lord said, I want you to make preparations to build a house for the Lord, a house for the ark. And gave these instructions to David. He wouldn't be able to build it, but he would be able to prepare it. And David said, who am I, O Lord? Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that thou hast brought me hitherto? The other justices were sitting on the dais, and one of them commented before he came up there that Brother Chris was going to come up and speak. And evidently he's known to speak over his time limit. And they said, well, he's a Primitive Baptist preacher, so he always speaks longer than he's supposed to. We're trying to get people to limit their speeches so it can go faster, but we know Brother Chris is going to go longer. And he did go a few minutes longer, but after he thanked a bunch of people, he then began his comments, and it was basically a sermon. And I've got that recorded, and I'll let you listen to it if you want to see what he preached to the citizens of Alabama and the Supreme Court of Alabama. And so I was just very, very thankful to the Lord that he had given this man, not just because he's a Primitive Baptist preacher, but if you know Brother Chris and you know his humility, he was one of the best men that you could ever pick for that high office. So thankful and gave glory to the Lord. So that was on Friday at 2 p.m. I skedaddled out of there about 4 and made it back down to Dothan about 6 to be able to eat dinner. And then I left very early the next morning to travel to McClenny because Elder Chris McCool and Elder Tim McCool were preaching a weekend meeting there. So I got to be there at McClenny Church Saturday morning. I was able to hear both Chris and his brother Tim, who, by the way, gave the invocation at the whole event, to preach that Saturday morning at at McClenny Primitive Baptist Church. There was a house full there. It was great to see a lot of people and friends that we hadn't seen in a long time, and the Lord truly blessed. Well, this morning, I'd like to preach to you a sermon. Hopefully the Lord will bless me to preach this morning, but in Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 11, Acts chapter 10, basically doctrinal. In Acts chapter 11, I'd like to pick a practical lesson from that. And I've thought about, the reason I've really sort of thought about this sermon subject matter today is that, Brother Chris on the Supreme Court, he is not going to be praised every time he gives an opinion. In fact, I would say anytime he gives an opinion on the Supreme Court, he is going to be criticized. It may even be worse. He may be even talked about. He may be maligned. There's always a hater out there ready to give criticism. So we're going to talk about a little bit how to handle criticism this morning. But for a basis of that, we want to start in Acts chapter 10, one of my favorite verses. It says in Acts chapter 10, verse 1, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. So we know that Cornelius was a centurion in the Roman army. And the Roman army was structured into legions. And within a certain legion, although it was further divided into centuries. That is, there was 100-men groups. Now that changed throughout time, the number of people that was in a century. But basically the idea was there would be 100 men, and the leader of that 100-men group inside the legion would be called a centurion. And a centurion was very highly respected. He was high in society, and he was paid much more, and he earned much more money than a regular legionnaire. And you'll see that this man seems like he is very wealthy. I think Roman soldiers had other ways of producing income as well. But the centurion, as the leader of 100 men, he had to be strict because he was responsible for them and their training. And centurions were known to be very strict and somewhat, you could say, harsh, and I could use some more extreme words than that. So these men were not teddy bears. They were, probably worse than any drill sergeant you ever heard about or ever experienced. But this is the man we're talking about. But listen to the description of this man. Now remember, he is a Roman. That means he is not a Jew. That means he was maligned by the Jews. Anybody that was not a Jew was goyim. And it was unlawful to eat with them. It was unlawful to socialize with them. They were basically taboo. It's not, you're not in this group. And certainly Gentiles like the centurion, Cornelius, were allowed to actually worship with the Jews, but they had to stay in the Gentile section. I won't go into that, specifics, but they had to be on the outside in a spot in the area known for holding Gentiles. So there were believers among the Gentiles, and evidently this man was blessed of God. There's no other way to say it. We can't choose to be lovers of God. We know that God has to come to us first. 1 John chapter 4 says we love him because he first loved us. Galatians is very specific in telling us that, devotion or anything approaching an appreciation from God or as a religious tenets will not come to a person unless they are first born again. Unless they have the Spirit of God, they're not going to have any spiritual appetite. This man has a spiritual appetite. Verse 2 says, a devout man, that means a godly man, and one that feared God with all his house. So not only was he reverenced God, but he probably influenced his whole family to reverence God as well, his whole house. And what did he do? Which gave much alms to the people. So he was generous. And probably this was not a common thing among centurion soldiers, is to be generous with the people. But he gave not just some alms, but he gave much alms to the people. And what did he do? He prayed to God always. Not sometimes, but always. You find a praying man, you have found a child of God, right? Remember the little preacher Ananias. He said, God told him, you're going to get a visitor. Oh, good. Who is it? We'll just have a great old time. It's Saul of Tarsus. He is persecuted and consented to the death of many of your people. No, I don't want that visitor, Lord. He is greatly feared. But the message came to him, behold, he prayeth. And because of that statement to Ananias, he felt, okay, I'm with you, Lord, on this one. Because if you found a praying man, you found a child of God. He prayed to God always. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming to him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And you find that God was intervening in both their lives. He was intervening in Cornelius' life, and he is going to be intervening in Peter's life in order to bring these people together. And I think that's how the Lord always works it. He works with the sinner, and he works with those that have the message. And he works with them both to bring them together. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. So he's letting him know, I've noticed what you've been doing. And now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. That's a strong ought there, right? But where's Peter? Peter is staying in some person's house, Simon the tanner, and it's a house by the sea. Brother Ronald Lawrence, who's coming for our annual meeting in May, he's been to the Middle East. Supposedly he's been to the Simon Tanner's house. And he's been at that house and he's looked at the sea. And he, in his mind's eye, went back to this situation with Peter praying at Simon the Tanner's house and wondering what it was like. And when the angel which spake unto Cornelius was departed, he called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. So we see Cornelius has got some cash here. He's got some money, and I think the Lord was blessing him in that regard. He had 2 servants and a devout, another godly soldier that waited on him continually. He told them to come to him. I want you to do something. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. On the morrow, as they drew on their journey and drew nigh to the cedar, now we switch to Peter's side of the story. Peter's at Simon the tanner's house. Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. So Peter, that was his practice to pray. And you can see he's on the rooftop. He's got a beautiful scene of the sea. And he's thanking the Lord for creation, I'm sure, and the blessings on his life. And he's up there for a prayer session before the Lord. And verse 10, and he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they had made ready, he fell into a trance. He's given a vision from heaven, and saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descended unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at 4 corners and let down to the earth. Remember, Peter's hungry, and he's gonna after he prays, he's gonna get some good old kosher food, because Peter is kosher. As the old saying goes, Peter was so kosher, he wouldn't even watch a cartoon with Porky Pig in it. He's so kosher. So he goes and he sees this vision, just a sheet let down from heaven, and it opens up, and wherein all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. Sounds a little prideful, but factual. It's probably he's never done that. Some people, brag, certain segments of religion think, I've never had a drop of alcohol touch my lips. You've heard that person, or making other boastful claims. So, it comes from a point of pride is my point. You can make factual statements, but sometimes you detect a little bit of pride in there. And you know what the Lord hates? He hates pride. There's 6 things the Lord hates, 7 are abomination to him, and his pride. So this Lord's going to cut down Peter a little bit, make him a little humble. He says, Not so, Lord. Can you imagine? The Lord appearing to you. I'm sure this wasn't a common event where the Lord's talking to somebody. And if the Lord started speaking to me, I'd have lots to ask and lots to say. But one thing I wouldn't do is say, Not so, Lord. For nothing uncommon or unclean has touched my lips. And the voice spake in him again the second time. What God, notice this language, what God hath cleansed, call not thou common. So the Lord has already cleansed. And of course, this is an allegory. He's really talking about Cornelius, right? He's going to go talk to Cornelius, who is unclean, just as unclean as an unkosher meal. You're not going to go visit this Cornelius, this Gentile, because you're going to see Peter's objection to this. But he was telling Peter through this allegory that this is a child of God. I've already cleansed him, so it's okay. Your record, you're still going to be 100-0, Peter. Nothing common or unclean is going to touch your lips if you go talk to Cornelius. And this was done thrice, 3 times. The vessel was received up again to heaven. And did Peter 3 times say, Not so, Lord, not so, Lord, not so, Lord? Sort of reminds me of him talking to the Lord, denying the Lord 3 times. And then the Lord asking him, Do you love me? 3 times. And what was the response? It says, Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, right? So I don't know if it happened 3 times that Peter made that statement. It's possible. Now, while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen should mean, right? It's an allegory now. It may be made clear to him then when he finally goes and meets Cornelius, but he's puzzled about it. Behold, the men which were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house, and stood before the gate. Yeah, these houses had outer gates. Remember when Peter was let out of prison miraculously, the earthquake shook, the chains came off, the doors opened, and he just walked out of the prison, and they're having a prayer session at Peter's house with his mama, and praying, Lord, just let Peter go. And Peter comes to the gate, and this little damsel comes to the gate, and is surprised, hey, it's Peter. She goes back and says, Peter's out of jail, and they laughed her little girl to scorn. Oh, we're praying, but we don't expect it to come to pass. So they didn't seem like they had a lot of faith, but the Lord was faithful and released Peter, and it was good for him and good for the people that were there. So they're at the gate asking about Peter at Simon the tanner's house. While Peter thought on this vision, the Spirit said unto him, Behold, 3 men seek thee. Arise therefore and get thee down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. So get up, Peter, whoever these people are, get with them and go with them wherever they say they're going. Then Peter went down to the men which were sent unto him from Cornelius and said, Behold, I am he whom ye seek. What is the cause before you are come? He said, Why are you here? How come you're here? I want to know. The message from the Lord said, probably go with them, no questions asked, but Peter's questioning still. And they said, Cornelius, the centurion, Gentile, but a just man, and one that feareth God, and of good report, what among all the nation of the Jews. Listen, this guy is so good, the Jews like him down where he comes from. I mean, he's got a good report. That's not easy to have. This was a godly, just, devout man. Was warned from God by a holy angel, and we know angels are messengers from God, to send thee unto his house and to hear words of thee. You need to go down there and preach to the Cornelius, this Gentile, and his house. Then called he them and lodged them, and on the tomorrow Peter went away with them, and certain brethren from Joppa accompanied him. And the morrow after they entered Caesarea, that's where they went. It was a city created in honor of Caesar. That's the reason it's called Caesarea. And Cornelius waited for them, and he had called them together, his kinsmen and near friends. And Peter was coming in. Cornelius met him, fell down at his feet, and worshiped him. That was the wrong thing to do, but he had a good heart, didn't he? I mean, Paul in Romans said, I have a zeal for my people, my kinsmen according to the flesh. He's talking about the Jewish people. For they have a zeal of God, not according to knowledge. In other words, they need to be given knowledge, right? They have the Spirit, but they lack the knowledge. And this man had the Spirit. He had a possession of the Spirit of God, but he needed knowledge. This is exactly why the preacher was sent to them, to tell them the proper way of worship and tell them the edicts of God. Knowledge is important. Wisdom is important. God says in James, if any man lacketh wisdom, let him ask. And that was quoted quite a bit during the investiture. If any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who will give generously, right? But what is knowledge? It's the facts, right? But wisdom takes those facts and knows how to use them. That's what wisdom is. You can run into a lot of educated people who have no wisdom at all, right? So the Lord, you can gain knowledge, but you need to have wisdom in order to use that knowledge. And I've told you this before. Knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing to not put it in your fruit salad, right? So Peter is gaining some wisdom here from the Lord. And from that wisdom, he is going to give Cornelius some knowledge. And then it will be up to Cornelius to pray for the Lord for wisdom in order to use that knowledge given to him. He fell in and worshiped, but Peter took him up. This is lesson number 1. Stand up, I myself also am a man. Remember how Peter described himself in our Bible study? He says, I also am an elder, which is among you. He didn't say, I'm the number 1 apostle, I've been given the keys of the kingdom, you need to treat me better. He made himself among the church, and he put himself equal with elders or pastors of the church. We established the context of elder there is not talking about some older, wiser person in the church, which we need in the church. But elder is an office in the church. It's the equivalent of bishop. In fact, we're going to change the sign outside that says Bishop Taylor. I like that better. Just kidding. Elder Taylor is an ordained office in the church. And Peter just says, I'm an elder like you. I'm nothing special. I'm in the church, amongst the church. And Peter says, I myself also am a man. And as he talked with him, he went in and found many that were come together. And I won't go on because we have limited time this morning. But as you know, as he spent time with Cornelius, Peter became very knowledgeable of what the Lord had him to do. historically and in context, Paul is known as the apostle to the Gentiles, where Peter was known as the apostle to the Jews. You know, Peter made that great preaching, oratory, sermon on the day of Pentecost. He was blessed. 5,000, I think 3,000 were added on that day. 5,000 were added a day or two later by baptism. And we see Paul as the great apostle to the Gentiles. He traveled amongst the Gentile people, establishing Jewish and Gentile churches. But here we have Peter as the first to go to the Gentiles, right? So he gains some knowledge, and he said he was astonished that the Lord worked with them. And he said, I can't find the verse exactly. He says, starting in verse 34, just read this. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. People take that phrase, no respecter of persons, out of context all the time. They say that's the reason God wants to reach every person on the face of the earth, but can't do it. But it's no respecter of persons. Everybody's got a fair shot. But this is never used in that context. It's always talking about no respecter of person. It means God does not respect a person just because he's a Jew or a Gentile or slave or bond or free. He's no respecter of persons. And that's what Peter's saying here. He says, but in every nation, not just the Jewish nation, but the Jewish and Gentile nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him, right? So Peter has this wonderful trip. I mean, it was a nervous type thing. It was when the Lord calls us out in faith, that's a scary thing. There's a lot of unknowns, but if we follow our faith, we should follow through, because the Lord said he would not leave us or forsake us, especially if he gives us a mission of faith, right? Peter had a lot of doubts, a lot of fears, but in the end, it was a wonderful experience for him, right? Now, after that wonderful experience, you know what happens. You all know what happens when you have a mountaintop experience. Get ready for the valley, because the valley's coming next. And the devil's not happy about this. So now here come the haters. Look over in Acts chapter 11. And it says, and the apostles and brethren that were in Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. Oh, they were happy about that, aren't they? No, I don't think so. Verse 2. And when Peter was come up to Jerusalem, he came to Jerusalem where they were, they that were of the circumcision, that's Jewish people of the circumcision, contended with him. And that's not a nice word, contend. They were upset. Saying, thou wentest in to men uncircumcised and didst eat with them. And this was an accusation. He was being criticized. I'm sure when they first heard, now listen, look at that verse. And the apostles and brethren of Judea heard that the Gentiles. So the rumor mill started up. And it always starts with them, right? They started talking. They heard this, they started circulating it, and the word got to them before even Peter could arrive. People, we also found this out in our Bible study, busybodies, we use that word a lot in jest. Peter equated it to the most heinous crimes on earth, like murder. You murder somebody's reputation by being a busybody. And where does that spirit come from? Certainly doesn't come from God. But, people out of genuine concern probably for the movement of the church said, oh, Peter's doing something. He's speaking the word to them, but he's eating with them. You don't eat with a Gentile. That's a violation. But of course, the whole point of, that's the reason God inspired someone to write the book of Hebrews, probably Paul. And the book of Hebrews, you know what the book of Hebrews is for. The book of Hebrews was written to the Hebrews, telling them not to be Hebrews, telling them that the tenets of the law have passed away. It's now the New Testament church. It's a different era. It's an era of freedom. Freedom from the constraints and rules and canons and tenets of the law. And one of those tenets of the law is that you don't eat with Gentiles. That's gone. That's gone away. Peter had to learn that lesson. Peter still believed that. After all the experiences he had in his 3.5-year ministry with Jesus Christ, and even after the resurrection, and him going and being taught more perfectly, and him realizing some errors of his own, and him believing fully in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead and how essential that message is to the people of God. And that truth is, he still had some things to learn about doing away with the law. And Peter learned that through this experience. And through Peter's experience, now the Jews as a whole were going to be taught this lesson. So what did Peter do? Did Peter get mad? Did Peter start, with did he get on Facebook and Twitter and start talking all that stuff? No, he talked face to face with these people. And it said he rehearsed, verse 4, but Peter rehearsed the matter from the beginning and expounded. Now that word rehearse, we use rehearsal. People rehearse their lines before they do the presentation. All that word means is rehear. So he's going to tell them the story again, right? He's telling them the story of what happened. And you can read Acts chapter 11, and Peter goes all through it, all about the divisions on both sides, and he went down there and preached to them. And after he rehearsed the whole situation to them, it all turned out right? He confronted criticism head on. And that's always a good thing to do. Don't start your own rumor campaign against the person that's criticized you, but go to that person and settle it one-on-one, and then it's done, right? Remember, everybody's get criticized. Jesus got criticized. He's a wine-bibber and a glutton, right? Peter was criticized. We see that. Paul was criticized heavily. In fact, if you're not criticized, that can be a sign that you're not you're not doing what you're supposed to. There was a period in America called the Great Awakening. There was a lot of preachers that went through the country, and hundreds of people came back to the churches. One of those people, I think, was John Wesley. And John Wesley rode and traveled around preaching to the people. And he was riding on his horse. This is a story that's attributed to him. He's riding his horse down the road and was thinking and meditating. And he thought, nobody has criticized me lately. Nobody's thrown an apple at me lately. Nobody's, yelled at me. Nobody's, whatever. He says, maybe I'm not doing the will of the Lord. And so he decided, I'm just going to get off my horse and start praying that if I'm not in the will of the Lord, that he tell me what I should do, what changes I should make. So he got off his horse and he kneeled down in the middle of the road and started praying. Well, here come this man down the road and saw him praying in the middle of the road, didn't like it. He grabbed an apple, threw it, and hit John Wesley in the head. And right in the middle of the prayer, after he got hit by the apple, he looked up and said, "Thank you, Lord. I am doing your will." So Peter's getting criticized. Well, now, what do you do when you are criticized? And you will be criticized. You have been criticized. How do you handle criticism? You know, preachers never get criticized. Deacons never get criticized. Women do not criticize other women. Children do not get bullied or criticized. Of course, you know I'm being sarcastic, correct? You know, the parable of the talents. You know, some people think their talent or spiritual gift is criticism. They really believe that. And I've said this before, but, you know, if I criticize somebody, it's constructive criticism. If anybody criticizes me, it's unconstructive criticism, correct? So not all criticism is bad, right? Some criticism is needed and it's good. It just depends, you know, like the motivation and what it is. But there is a spiritual way to handle that, as Peter did in our text. We can all be critics. We can all be professional critics. We've all been criticized, and some of us have been criticized harshly. But what do you do with that criticism? Well, I think you do what Nehemiah did. You know, Nehemiah was given the commission of God to go back and build the house of God, the gates. So he prayed to the Lord, got the blessing of the king, and he was sent down there. And he started rebuilding the wall. But what happened? Well, we know there's some characters down there that started criticizing them. One of them, I think, was up in Samaria, who was a ruler up in Samaria, which is the northern section of Jerusalem. And, you know, he was the king, he was a boss hog, you know, he had everything going on his own, he was in control. But then here comes this Nehemiah, and they're rebuilding the walls, and they're not asking him permission to do it, and some of the other people, so they start criticizing and worse, right? But how did Nehemiah consider that? I think he considered criticism just like he handled prayer and the will of the Lord. He had been praying for years intensely that somehow, some way, God would give him the opportunity to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. Anyway, and he was praying and praying for that. And then he was the king's cupbearer. He had access to the king, but if you displeased the king, you could be put to death immediately. So the king was pleased with him one day and said, basically, what do you want? And Nehemiah immediately said, well, send me back to Jerusalem so I can rebuild. No. Nehemiah stepped back, mentally took a step back, and prayed to the Lord in that instance, even when he was standing in front of a king that could kill him. He took the time to pray to the Lord. Is this your will? Is this full enough? Any other person would say, well, here it is, let's go. But he took a step back and he considered. And that's what we all need to do when we're faced with criticism. We all need, sometimes we don't like criticism. We do not like it at all. And most of the time we brush it off. But biblically, when we get criticized, we need to comprehend. And you get a comprehension of the criticism. Because why is that? We need to have a comprehension of it because sometimes the Lord will send somebody to us in any situation, and God can use that person to criticize you to identify any blind spots in your life. So that's the reason somebody may come to criticize you, and it may be a person that's criticized you before. Some person you don't have respect for. They're, somebody that, well, they're not in the church. You don't think they have any wisdom. But any time that we do have criticism, we need to take a step back and comprehend and evaluate and analyze and scrutinize every criticism we make because God may be using that person to talk to you and identify a blind spot. Now, I've never been criticized before in my life. That's a lie. And I'm in church, so I can't lie. Wait till after church. Now, but people have come up to me and they've identified something wrong with what I said in a sermon, and you could tell they were very proud about them identifying this so they could tell me. And I would bristle, like one of these ridgeback dogs, the hair would stand out in the back, And I handled it very immaturely. And if I would step back, sometimes what they were identifying to me, even though they did it, I don't think probably in the right spirit, they just wanted to be a gotcha person. But what they told me was exactly right. What they told me was something I preached incorrectly. I picked it up by tradition or heard it maybe from someone else and repeated it. And when I actually sat down to analyze it and quit and not reject it offhand, I was saying, that's right. I'm not preaching that correctly. And what else? And that spurred me to think about what else have I preached. It wasn't some major point, but thank goodness. But it's what else have I been preaching that maybe I picked up, by tradition instead of from thus saith the Lord. Maybe I picked it up from the book of Jabbo instead of the book of John, right? So you need to analyze it, scrutinize it, comprehend it to see if there's any validity to the criticism. Even if you don't respect the person, even if you don't think they are worthy of criticizing you, because that's a point of pride in and of itself, but consider it because it could be, valid, and God could be using that person to be able to identify some kind of default or blind spot in your life. Now, after you analyze it, and you comprehend it, if it has no validity, then you need to still take it to the Lord and take it and do away with it. Just cast it aside. Cast it behind your back and say, this was not a valid criticism after considering using it and using your wisdom. So that's how to handle that initial criticism. But not only people that come up to criticize you, but just negative people in general. If you say in, they say out. If you say up, they say down. If you say around, they say no. And so what do you do with those people? Once again, you need to take it to the Lord. Is this correct or is this untrue? If it's untrue, you disregard it. If it's unfair but true, you accept it. If it's done through ignorance, you smile at it. But if it's true, you learn from it. So those 4 points are valid. So in our story, they said, you're eating with unclean people. Peter was criticized. But notice who he's being criticized by. Now, when you're being criticized by someone, let's say, outside of the church, or maybe if you're criticized by an enemy, that's one kind of criticism. But how about if you're criticized by one of your own people, by somebody inside, by somebody that's close to you? What hurts worse? You know the answer to that. What hurts worse? We know which one hurts worse. So we have to really think about that, but still go through the same process. We need to comprehend it, as he's teaching us in Acts chapter 11. We need to comprehend of the subject. And then after we make the comprehension, we need to be committed to either casting it off or making a change in our life. And after we do that, we need to give thanks to the Lord. When we're talking about criticism, brothers and sisters, we need to analyze it. We also need to think about its motivation. Its motivation and where the information come from. In verse 1 it says, they heard, right? They heard this. And sometimes what people hear is not the correct information. The famous word now, everybody uses it, is misinformation. You know, we need to think about that. But brothers and sisters, we need to handle criticism like we handle anything in life. We need to take it to the Lord and ask for wisdom to discern it and see if it's correct or not. If it is, even if we hate, if we don't like the messenger, still listen to the message and make the corrections in your life. Thankful for your attention this morning. Hope the Lord will bless it to your profit. And we'll ask the Lord to dismiss us this morning after announcements and prayer. Are there any announcements to make this morning? Brother Carter?